The air was heavy, thick with unease. Chris found the old letter among his things. The handwriting, faint and shaky, sent a chill down his spine. It was addressed to him, though the return address read only the past. As he read through the letter, his heart began to race. It spoke of a curse, one that had followed him from abroad, a curse tied to an event he could never remember but always felt. His first thought was to dismiss it, but something gnawed at him. That feeling in his gut was unmistakable. This was no prank. This was a warning. He dropped the letter as the lights flickered, and the air grew inexplicably colder. The following night, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His sleep had been restless, plagued by nightmares of a foreign place he had never visited, yet he recognized every detail. The letter weighed heavily on him. He had to know what was going on. The darkness seemed thicker that night, and every creak of the house made him jump. He walked to the attic hoping to find some answers. But the moment he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the corner, was an old suitcase, one he had never seen before. His heart raced as he approached, dreading what he might find inside. He slowly approached the suitcase, the rustling of his footsteps on the wooden floor deafening in the silence. When he finally reached it, he hesitated, a part of him wanting to walk away. But curiosity was stronger. As he opened the suitcase, his heart stopped. Inside, nestled among old clothes and dusty newspapers, was a small, ancient-looking artifact. It was covered in strange symbols, ones he recognized from the letter. He felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just an object. It was the key. Chris dropped the suitcase and stumbled back, his mind racing. He could feel something watching him, a presence, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. He was not alone. Chris couldn't breathe. The artifact pulsed with energy, and the room grew colder. The whispers began, faint at first, then louder. He looked around the attic frantically, but there was no one. The whispers were in his mind, and they grew louder until they screamed. He clutched his head, sinking to his knees. "What do you want?" he shouted into the empty room. The whispering stopped. And then he heard it. A voice, deep and sinister, speaking his name. "You cannot run from me, Chris," it said. "You carry the curse with you, and now it's time to pay." In the chaos, Chris couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the artifact and bolted from the attic, not knowing where he was going or what he was doing. His only thought was to escape, to get as far away from the curse as possible. As he ran through the house, the walls seemed to close in, the floorboards creaking beneath him as if the house itself were alive. He couldn't see anything clearly. His mind was consumed with fear. The whispers followed him, louder now, taunting him. He burst through the door, desperate to escape the house, but the night air felt colder than ever. There was no escape from what had followed him from abroad. No running from the curse. Days passed, but the presence of the curse never left Chris. It was as if it was embedded in every corner of his life. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't escape it. The figure was always watching, lurking in the shadows. Chris began to unravel the mysteries surrounding the artifact, hoping it would give him answers. He dug deeper into his family's past, but the more he uncovered, the more questions he had. There were hidden documents, old letters and photos, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. But then, he found something that made his blood run cold. A letter written by his father, detailing the origins of the curse and its connection to the artifact. The letter spoke of an ancient ritual, one that had been performed many years ago to bind the curse to the family bloodline. But there was one key detail that stopped Chris in his tracks. His father had written, "The curse must be passed on." He realized that he was the one meant to inherit it. The shopkeeper led Chris to a back room, where the walls were covered in maps and strange symbols. As he set the artifact on the table, Chris couldn't shake the sense of urgency building inside him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The shopkeeper's face grew serious. "That artifact is a key," he explained. "A key to something far darker than you realize." Chris' heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How is it tied to me?" The old man sighed deeply. It's tied to a curse that was set in motion long before your time. And now, it's following you. But there's more. It's not just a curse. It's a force, something that wants control. You've been marked. Chris recoiled, his mind racing. The truth was more horrifying than he had imagined. The curse was real, and it was coming for him. As the shopkeeper explained, Chris felt the weight of his past unraveling before him. The curse wasn't just a random event. It was something tied to his bloodline, a family secret that had been buried for generations. You're not the first to be chosen, the shopkeeper continued. Your family, they made a pact long ago, and it's come back to collect its debt. Chris felt his stomach churn as the reality of his situation sank in. Why me? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. The shopkeeper looked at him with sympathy. Because you're the last of your line who hasn't been consumed by it, but now it's too late, the curse has found you and you cannot escape it. Chris turned away, feeling like the walls were closing in. The shopkeeper's words echoed in his head. You've been marked. Chris spent the following days in a haze, trying to come to terms with the truth about the curse. But the whispers never stopped. They followed him, grew louder, until they became more than just voices. They were images, memories of a past he had no recollection of but could now see clearly. He saw a dark figure standing in the shadows of his childhood home, eyes glowing with malice. The figure had been watching him for years. And now, it was coming for him. Chris tried to shake off the vision, but it lingered, an inescapable presence. The air around him grew thick, heavy with an unnatural chill. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him, always lurking just out of sight. And then it happened, a knock at the door. Chris opened the door, only to find no one there. But as he stepped outside, the chill in the air intensified. He could hear a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves, but it felt alive, as if it was coming from the ground itself. Chris' heart pounded in his chest. He turned to go back inside, but something caught his eye. A figure, standing across the street, watching him. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Chris felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew that this was it. The curse had found him, and it was not going to let him go. He rushed back inside, slamming the door behind him. The whispers grew louder, and the room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on him. It was only a matter of time before the curse claimed him, body and soul. Days passed, but the presence of the curse never left Chris. It was as if it was embedded in every corner of his life. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't escape it. The figure was always watching, lurking in the shadows. Chris began to unravel the mysteries surrounding the artifact, hoping it would give him answers. He dug deeper into his family's past, but the more he uncovered, the more questions he had. There were hidden documents, old letters and photos, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. But then, he found something that made his blood run cold. A letter, written by his father, detailing the origins of the curse and its connection to the artifact. The letter spoke of an ancient ritual, one that had been performed many years ago to bind the curse to the family bloodline. But there was one key detail that stopped Chris in his tracks. His father had written, "The curse must be passed on." He realized that he was the one meant to inherit it. The realization hit Chris like a freight train. He was the one destined to carry the curse, but he had no idea how to break it. The more he researched, the more he discovered that the curse was not just tied to the artifact, but to an ancient blood pact, a ritual made centuries ago. His ancestors had unknowingly bound the family to the entity that haunted them, and now it was his turn to pay the price. But Chris wasn't going to accept his fate. He decided to confront the truth head-on. He needed to find the missing piece, the final step in the ritual that could end this nightmare. He spent every waking hour searching for answers, but the more he uncovered, the more terrifying the truth became. The curse was not just a haunting. It was a living, breathing force, one that could not be controlled. And it had already chosen its next victim. As Chris continued his search, a terrifying truth slowly began to surface. The figure that had been haunting him was no mere ghost. It was the manifestation of the curse itself, a force that was growing stronger with each passing day. He had been chosen not to break the curse but to serve it. The entity that controlled the curse had been using Chris' bloodline for centuries, manipulating events to ensure that the curse would never be broken. The letter from his father had been the final clue. Chris was not just a victim, he was a tool, a vessel for the curse to continue its reign. And the worst part? He could no longer deny it. He had begun to feel the same dark pull, the same thirst for control that had plagued his ancestors. The curse had taken root in him. The curse's power was undeniable now. Chris felt it within him, an icy grip on his soul, a relentless pull toward darkness. The entity that had plagued his family for centuries was now inside him, whispering promises of power, of freedom from the fear that had haunted him for so long. But as the darkness within him grew, Chris fought to maintain control. He could feel the presence of the entity, pressing against the edges of his consciousness, trying to take over. The whispers were louder now, urging him to embrace his fate, to let the curse consume him. But Chris knew he couldn't give in. He had to fight back, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He couldn't let the curse win. The final confrontation was inevitable. Chris could no longer avoid the truth. The curse had come for him, and there was no escaping it. But as he stood in front of the old, crumbling altar deep in the forest, he realized that the only way to end it was to confront the entity directly. The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath him vibrating with dark energy. Chris stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest. He had one chance to end this, one chance to break the cycle. With the artifact in his hand, he stepped forward, ready to face the darkness that had followed him from abroad. "I won't let you win," he whispered to the entity that had haunted his every step. The air was suffocating. Chris could feel the dark presence surrounding him, pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He stood before the altar, his fingers gripping the artifact as if his life depended on it. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. He could hear his name being called, over and over again, urging him to give in. "You cannot fight what you are," the voice whispered. "You were always meant to be mine." Chris clenched his jaw and closed his eyes. He couldn't let the entity win, not after everything he had fought for. He had to end it, here and now. Chris held the artifact high, and as he did, a flash of light erupted from it, illuminating the surrounding forest with an unnatural glow. The whispers ceased. For a brief moment, everything was still. For a moment, Chris thought it was over. The silence was deafening, and the oppressive presence that had haunted him for so long seemed to have dissipated. But then the ground beneath him trembled, and a deep guttural roar echoed from the forest. Chris spun around, his heart racing. The entity had not been vanquished. It was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Chris stumbled backward, his grip on the artifact tightening. "You can't escape me," the voice hissed, now louder and more menacing. Chris felt the artifact pulse in his hand, and he knew what he had to do. This was his final chance. If he failed, the curse would never end. The entity emerged from the darkness, its form taking shape in front of Chris. It was a towering, shadowy figure, its face obscured by a cloak of darkness. Chris could feel the weight of its gaze on him, a pressure that seemed to push him to the ground. "You are nothing," the entity growled, its voice like the sound of 1,000 whispers. "You cannot stop me." But Chris refused to give in. With the artifact pulsing in his hand, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I won't let you win," he said, his voice steady. The entity laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. But Chris knew what he had to do. The curse had to end here, or it would never stop. With a single decisive motion, Chris raised the artifact higher, the energy from it surging through his body. The ground beneath him cracked open as the power of the artifact collided with the dark entity. The entity screamed in fury, its form shifting wildly, trying to escape the light. But it was too late. The light from the artifact expanded, consuming the forest and engulfing the entity. For a moment Chris thought he might be torn apart by the force of the blast, but then the light faded. The forest was silent once more. Chris collapsed to his knees, exhausted, but the presence was gone. The curse had been broken. The battle was over, but the consequences of the curse's destruction were still settling in. Chris stood alone in the center of the forest, the remains of the entity fading into nothingness. The light from the artifact had faded, leaving only the quiet aftermath. As the world around him grew still, Chris couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Was the curse gone for good? The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. But deep inside, a lingering thought gnawed at him. He had broken the curse, but at what cost? Chris wasn't sure if he had won or if something far worse had been unleashed. As he walked away from the altar, he knew one thing for certain. The battle against darkness was far from over. Weeks had passed since the confrontation in the forest. Chris had returned to his normal life, or at least he tried to. The nightmares had stopped, and the whispers were no longer there to torment him. But even though the darkness seemed to be gone, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. He looked around the quiet room, the once familiar space now feeling foreign, as if the curse had left an indelible mark on everything it touched. Chris had saved himself, but had he truly freed his family? He didn't know the answer. Every time he looked at the artifact, the weight of its power seemed to draw him back into the past. It was tempting to ignore the memories, to pretend like the terror never existed. But he knew better now. The curse might be gone, but its shadow would always follow him. The days grew quieter, but the unease in Chris never fully disappeared. He couldn't help but notice the small things, a flicker in the corner of his eye, the fleeting shadow that never seemed to go away. It was as if the curse was always one step behind him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He began to question his actions. Had he truly broken the curse, or had he only delayed the inevitable? The silence in his life became unsettling, the calm before the storm. One night, as Chris lay in bed, the whispers returned, faint at first, but then growing louder, filling the room with an eerie familiarity. "You thought you could escape," the voice hissed. Chris' heart pounded in his chest. The nightmare wasn't over. The whispers continued to haunt Chris for days, and with each passing hour, the weight of the curse seemed to grow heavier. He couldn't escape the truth. The curse was not just a supernatural force, it was a part of him, embedded in his very soul. He had broken the entity, but the price of freedom was far higher than he had anticipated. The silence between him and the world around him grew more unbearable. He turned to the only person who might still have answers, the old shopkeeper. When he arrived at the shop, the air was thick with the scent of incense and dust. The shopkeeper was sitting in the back, as though waiting for Chris. "You're here," the old man said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. "You've learned the hard truth, haven't you?" The shopkeeper spoke softly, recounting the curse's true origins, how it had been passed down through generations, each bearer becoming a tool for the darkness that loomed over the family. "It's never truly gone," the shopkeeper said. "The curse is like a disease. It can be suppressed, but it always finds its way back." Chris felt his stomach drop as the old man's words settled in. "So what now?" Chris asked, his voice barely a whisper. The shopkeeper looked at him with a deep, knowing gaze. "Now, you live with it," he replied. "But you've broken the entity's hold. It will never have the same power over you again. But be warned, the darkness is part of you now, and you must be vigilant." Chris nodded slowly, realizing that no matter how much he wished for peace, it was something he would have to create for himself. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. Chris spent the following days in reflection, trying to come to terms with everything he had learned. The curse had been broken, but the darkness within him remained. He felt it, lurking in the back of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. But Chris knew that he couldn't let it control him. The whispers were faint, almost imperceptible now, but they still echoed in his mind. Chris had learned the truth. He could never escape the curse, but he could choose how to live with it. He walked away from the shop, the artifact in his hand, knowing that his journey was far from over. The curse may follow him, but he had the power to face it on his own terms. Chris had spent months trying to live a life untouched by the shadows of the curse. It was no easy task. The nightmares had stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the corners of his life. The artifact, now a mere relic on his shelf, was a constant reminder of the dark force that had once controlled him. Despite his best efforts, the peace he longed for seemed like a fleeting illusion. One evening, while walking home, he noticed a faint figure at the edge of his vision. It was a silhouette, tall, vague, and shrouded in darkness. His heart skipped a beat. He had thought the curse was over. He had fought the entity, broken the cycle. Yet, here it was, once again, lingering just out of reach, like a phantom from his past. "I thought I was free," Chris whispered to himself, but the figure stepped closer, a chilling presence that sent a cold shiver down his spine. As the figure drew closer, Chris could make out a faint outline of a face, cold and emotionless. It was the same figure he had seen in his nightmares. Chris stopped dead in his tracks. The world around him seemed to freeze as he faced this final manifestation of the curse. The figure tilted its head, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You thought you could escape?" it whispered, the voice sounding distant and otherworldly. Chris stepped back, his pulse quickening, but he couldn't bring himself to look away. The figure's presence was suffocating, its very existence reminding him that the curse had never truly been broken. "What do you want?" Chris demanded, his voice trembling. The figure remained silent for a moment, then answered, "You can never be free." "Not truly." The figure's words cut through Chris like a knife. He felt the weight of its presence pressing in on him. The curse, he realized, wasn't just a force he could defeat. It was part of him, embedded in his bloodline. He had tried to break the cycle, to fight the darkness, but it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. The entity wasn't just some external force. It was tied to him, to his family's past, and no matter how far he ran, it would always follow. "What are you?" Chris asked, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his chest. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. "I am the darkness you cannot escape," it said. "I am your inheritance." The truth of the curse's power sank in. Chris wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to stop the cycle of suffering for good. The entity's words echoed in Chris's mind. The curse was a part of him, not just something he could escape. It had been passed down from one generation to the next, always waiting for the right moment to resurface. But Chris refused to let it control him any longer. He knew now that he couldn't fight the curse in the same way. He needed to understand it, to confront it head-on. With the artifact still in his hand, Chris felt a surge of energy coursing through him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like the power to finally end this. "I will end this," Chris muttered, as the artifact in his hand began to glow once again. The entity stepped forward, but this time, Chris stood firm. The final battle was not against an external force, but against the darkness within himself. The light from the artifact grew brighter, filling the entire clearing with its intensity. The entity screeched in fury, as it was engulfed in the light. Chris felt the power surge through him, but it wasn't just the artifact's power. It was his own will, his determination to stop the curse. He focused on the light, channeling all his strength into it. The entity writhed and howled, but it couldn't escape the light. Slowly, the darkness began to dissipate. Chris felt the weight of the curse lifting, like 1,000 chains falling away. The entity's form began to break apart, vanishing into nothingness. As the last remnants of the darkness faded, Chris collapsed to the ground, exhausted but free. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, Chris felt a sense of peace. The aftermath was quiet. Chris had hoped for peace, a return to normalcy after everything he had endured. But peace was fleeting, and it didn't last long. It was as if the universe had allowed him to think he was free before the final test. As he sat in the same room where it all started, staring at the artifact that once cursed him, something felt off. He had won, yes, but a deep unease settled in his chest. Was the curse truly over, or had it merely taken a new form? Chris thought back to the shopkeeper's words. The curse is never truly gone. It only waits for the right moment. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, and the familiar whispers, now faint, began to return. The darkness hadn't fully vanished, it had only been contained. Chris stared at the artifact, a sudden realization dawning upon him. The curse was not an external force, it was part of him, and it was never going to let him go. The whispers grew louder, and Chris felt the weight of them pressing down on him. It wasn't just his mind playing tricks, he could feel it now. The dark presence had not left. It had returned, but it wasn't attacking. It was waiting. He had spent so much time trying to escape the curse, to rid himself of the supernatural force that haunted him. But now, in the dead of night, it became clear. The curse wasn't a force he could fight off. It was part of him. It had always been. The artifact that had once held so much power now felt like an extension of himself. Was he cursed to carry this burden forever? Chris closed his eyes, but the whispers grew louder, clearer. "You're mine," they said. Chris knew then that there was no escaping this. The curse had claimed him, not in the way he'd expected, but in a far more insidious way. It had become him. Days passed, and Chris grew more withdrawn. He couldn't escape the curse. It was embedded in him now. The whispers never stopped. The shadows followed him wherever he went. He had tried to live a normal life, to push through the fear, but it was impossible. Every step he took was haunted by the knowledge that the curse was not just some external force, but a part of him. One evening, as Chris sat in the darkness of his room, he finally understood the truth. The curse was a part of his bloodline. It was a force, a darkness that had existed for generations, woven into the fabric of his family's past. And no matter what he did, he would always be connected to it. He had broken the cycle once, but it would never be truly gone. He had been chosen, not to break it, but to carry it forward. Chris knew now that there would be no happy ending. The curse wasn't something that could be destroyed, it was something that could only be carried. The artifact, once a symbol of his suffering, had now become a part of him. The darkness that had haunted his family for generations would always be with him. But despite the despair, he found a strange sense of peace. He had accepted his fate. The curse might follow him forever, but it no longer had the power to control him. Chris stood up, looking at the artifact one last time. "I will live with this," he whispered to himself. "I will face it every day, but it will not break me." The final moment arrived. Chris stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. As he walked down the quiet street, he could still feel the weight of the curse. But he no longer feared it. It was a part of him, and he had accepted it. The whispers no longer controlled his every thought, and the shadows no longer haunted his every step. The curse would follow him, but he had chosen to live with it. As Chris walked into the night, the faintest glimmer of peace washed over him. The battle had been long, and the scars would remain, but for now, he was free. At least in this moment.